Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Alrighty, Deleuze, difference and repetition. So we are in that first chapter, difference in itself, and we're looking to finish that up today before we move on to repetition for itself next week in the next video. So this video I've broken up into two parts. The first part is about Plato, and the second part is just kind of a wrap up of this chapter, just kind of trying to draw some conclusions and clarify some of the ideas, the main ideas that I think come from this chapter. The first section, Plato. So regarding Plato, Deleuze says that our aim here is to overturn Platonism. But it's not a complete overhaul of Plato. There are parts of Plato that we want to keep, and particularly regarding difference, Plato, or Deleuze sees Plato as preserving difference in a way that Aristotle doesn't. Preserves difference, even though he ultimately subsumes it in a one, in a harmonious kind of whole, a totality, what we called in the last video a harmonious organism. So there is difference in Plato. It's preserved, and it's what Deleuze is looking to do is see how Plato preserves difference in contrast with Aristotle. And even though Plato looks to eliminate difference, ultimately, there is still something of note to take from Plato in his dialogues. So he identifies four figures in the Platonic dialectic. The first of these is the selection of difference. And here Deleuze is talking about the way that Plato preserves difference in a clear division between good and bad, or authentic and inauthentic, real and fake. So you have that's where difference is kept alive in Plato. Contrasting with Aristotle's method of division, which divides a determinate genus into definite species according to a concept in general. And so that, if you remember in the last video, we talked about representation and the way that was affected and mediated difference through a genus species kind of approach. And that's what Aristotle advocates here. You've got instead of keeping the two things separate, one is becoming subsumed under the other, in terms of the one being a species belonging to this broader category, which is the genus. And that's Aristotle's method of division, as opposed to Plato's method of division, which is that stark good and bad, authentic and inauthentic. There is no subsuming one under the other there. So the difference is preserved. That's what Deleuze means when he says that. And one of the things, he compares this to the search for gold. It's not about finding different species that can fit under this a broader category when we're looking for gold. Gold is either pure or impure. It's either real or fake. It's a stark difference where the two things just can't be mediated, where the difference between them can't be mediated, can't be eliminated. The examples that Deleuze uses from Plato's dialogues, he talks about the statesman, in which the statesman is defined as one who knows the pastoral care of men. And the problem is that many people think they know this. Many people think they are good caretakers of humankind. including merchants, farmers, bakers, all of these people, these professions, feel that they are statesman-like. They are providing for this, the well-being of the community. And so what we have to do is find which one is right? Which one is the statesman, as opposed to all these other people who aren't. So there's that real and fake division, which is preserved in Plato. The same in the Phaedrus, where it's a question of defining the good madness and the true lover. Again, the question is one of authenticating, attempting to distinguish between, and this is the expression Deleuze uses, true and false claimants, as opposed to identifying and classifying, which is the Aristotelian method of division, ordering different groups into a kind of cohesive whole. That's which eliminates the difference, which subsumes difference into a coherent totality. So how does Plato establish difference? He preserves it. He has this clear good and bad, authentic, inauthentic difference established. But how does he decide between the two? How does he decide which is good, which is bad? Well, this is where the installation of a myth comes in for Deleuze. In all of Plato's dialogues, they turn on a myth, which is kind of surprising, right, for philosophy, that a philosopher could turn to myth in this way. And that would be an Aristotelian objection to this, that without mediation, without this genus-species division, you are resorting to myth in your philosophizing. But Deleuze embraces this. And I think if you cast your mind back to the very first video where we talked about the way dynamic repetition disguises itself, and it operates through symbols, through signs. That's the element of myth that Deleuze keeps alive from Plato. It's not about myth as in believing that your myth is some kind of is reality in some way. That's not what's of value here. What's of value and what we want to keep alive from Plato's tradition is this the sense in which it's not reality is not literal. It's not. It doesn't proceed through logical, analytical categories. It's concepts. Rather, it trades in myth. It trades in symbols. It trades in subterfuge, concealment. That's how repetition works. It works through these kinds of things, not through literal, objective ideas that can be perfectly encapsulated in concepts, which can then be ordered into a kind of representation of reality. We have to accept this element of myth. Again, not in the sense that we're creating a fantasy, which could be true, could be not, but we're just going to believe it anyway. That's absolutely not what is going on here. We're not creating a supernatural framework for our philosophy. That's religion, right? That's not what Deleuze is endorsing here. It's this idea of concealment, of disguise, and that's just the way that's the way life works. That's the way reality, metaphysical reality, operates. So the installation of a myth, Deleuze embraces that, and his examples again, with the statesman, the myth here is the image of an ancient god, which is invoked, and only this being deserves the name of the shepherd king of mankind, the statesman. None of the other human claimants are on a par with this shepherd king, this god, this myth. But there is a certain care of the community that they do undertake, which derives from this shepherd king, or partakes in something which the shepherd king is an exemplar of. And so that's how the myth gives us the means to distinguish between the true and the false here, with regards to the statesman. And the same in the Phaedrus, where Plato talks about souls before being incarnated and their memory of the ideas, capital I, the ideas that they've been contemplating. And so again, that the idea of a myth is brought in to allow us to distinguish which is real, which is fake. And the third element, the third figure in the Platonic dialectic, is the establishment of a foundation. So this is a ground which is constituted by the myth as the principle of a test or selection which imparts meaning to the method of division by fixing the degrees of an elective participation. That's a quote. I didn't put the quote up, but I'm just reading that straight out of the book. So we're setting up a ground. We're using the myth to give us a test, essentially, to give us something we can use to distinguish the good and the bad by seeing degrees of participation. How much do you participate in this quality exemplified by the myth that we created in the second figure? The ground in the statesman is the shepherd god, the shepherd king. That is the statesman in its perfect form. And once we have that, once we have that myth established, then we can see that gives us the test, that gives us the benchmark against which we can measure all of these other claimants and see how closely they come, how closely they come to this ideal. And the way that Plato phrases it is in terms of participation. How I guess we could say purely do they participate in the quality of the shepherd king that makes it the statesman, the perfect statesman. And so that's our test. That's the foundation. The foundation is that myth which lets us determine how worthy each claimant is of that title. And the same with the Phaedrus, where the myth is Plato's doctrine of the forms. And Deleuze talks about the form of justice. Justice then is the ground. The form of justice is the ground. That's the myth. Well, the myth is the doctrine of the forms. The ground is the form of justice itself. The quality of justice is the object that is wholly possessed by this ground, by the form of justice. Possessed might be a little bit leading, maybe embodied by the form. The form of justice perfectly embodies the quality of justice. And the function of the ground is to allow participation. It allows people to participate in that quality that it possesses, that it embodies, justice. And the the people, they are the claimants who participate unequally in the object, in the quality of justice. So some people participate more than others, they get closer to that ideal, they embody the form of justice more, or the quality of justice, which is, you get it, you see how how it's structured there. So that's what we've got so far with those three figures. The selection of difference is preserved. The installation of a myth to establish difference, to something to ground our difference in, and then the establishment of a foundation which gives us the test to determine whether there is, in this case, how much of the goodness there is in a particular claimant. But it gives us the test for deciding between authentic and inauthentic. And the fourth figure then is the positing of a question-problem complex. And this is about the test itself. This is in what the test consists, i.e., an enigma to be resolved, a problem to be sorted through, a question to be answered. However, this is not the problematic structure here is not to do with an insufficiency in knowledge. It's not, when I say a question to be answered, I don't mean a kind of, I'm not thinking in terms of like maths or something where you've got a discrete finite question and it has one discrete finite answer that matches it and that eliminates it, that gets rid of it. That's totally not what we're talking about. Because that would be an insufficiency in knowledge. Once you know the answer, the question disappears. Rather, for Deleuze, the problematic structure is a part of the objects themselves. It's what allows them to be grasped as signs and a response given. And if you remember the way that we talked about, was it in the first video? I think it was the very first video, when we discussed learning to swim, and the way that was a response to the sign the wave gave us, or the question that the wave posed to us. Our response, our learned behavior was a response to that question that the wave put to us. And it's the same kind of thing here. It's not about, here's a problem, here's a solution, you've eliminated it, you've solved it, the problem's gone. The problematic structure is a part of the way reality is. It's the way that reality works. It's the way that difference and repetition operate. It's essential to that whole structure that Deleuze is talking about. And so once we have this question-problem complex, that's what the test is, then Deleuze goes on to say that being then corresponds to the essence of the problem or the question. Like I said, that's what reality is. That's what Deleuze is getting at here. Being itself is, or corresponds to, the essence of this problem or the question. So then he says, if we can understand the problem or the question as non-being, in the sense of not being fixed, not being complete, not being determined, finite, not being finite, if we can understand problems or questions in that sense as non-being, then to distinguish this from non as negation, Deleuze calls this non in brackets, non-being. So he puts the non in brackets and uses that expression, non-being, to describe being. Another way that he does this is he uses a question mark instead of the non. So we have this question mark / being. And that just seems kind of unnecessarily confusing. I mean, it's pretty clear what he's trying to do, but it just seems like I don't know. It seems overly complicated to the point where he's just trying to say, he wants to say being is non-being, make it kind of seem contradictory, but it seems awkward to me. But anyway, that's what he says. The essence of what he's saying is that the problem or the question is difference, and being corresponds to the essence of the problem or the question. Therefore, being is difference. That's kind of what we're getting at here. And if you remember in the last video, I said being is not a genus because it's the possibility of being for specific differences. That nice expression, that quote that I pulled out for you. Being is not a genus because it's the possibility of being for specific differences. That ties in exactly with what we've come back to here. We've kind of come full circle now. We're saying the same thing. Being is difference. Being is not a fixed substance-like thing. It's not a finite concept which can be represented in a conceptual model. It is fundamentally this problem, question, difference. There are resolutions proffered, and and new questions arise on the basis of that. And it's just this constant interplay, this constant flux of problems and questions and resolutions and answers that in which difference is never eliminated, because difference is at the very heart of the process itself. So we're back to that. And that's basically Plato. And just before we leave him and look to wrap up this chapter, I wanted to mention briefly a little bit about simulacra, which kind of crops up at the end and is turns out to be quite important for Deleuze here. So I've got a quote. I'll give you the quote and then we'll break it down. The whole of Platonism is dominated by the idea of drawing a distinction between the thing itself and the simulacra, the original and the image, the model and the copy. Difference is not thought in itself, but related to a ground, subordinated to the same and subject to mediation in mythic form. Overturning Platonism, then, means denying the primacy of original over copy, of model over image, glorifying the reign of simulacra and reflections. So, for Plato, yes, he keeps difference alive. It's preserved. There is an absolute difference which doesn't get mediated, or which can't be mediated, but he gets around that with his model of with his myth, in which people can participate in to varying degrees. So there is a sense of difference. There is a sense in which difference is preserved, but there's also it's kind of in the background. And what's brought to the fore is the way that everything participates in this pristine original, this perfect original, whatever it is, form or whatever it is you're talking about, the statesman. So if we want to overturn Platonism, what we're going to have to do is deny the primacy of the original, get rid of that the ideal against which everything else is measured. So because if you have that set up, everything else becomes different, yes, but only different in relation to this idealized one, this idealized original. Rather, Deleuze says the simulacra, the copies themselves, have to become more important than the original. And that brings me to this quote. Things are simulacra themselves. Simulacra are the superior forms, and the difficulty facing everything is to become its own simulacrum, to attain the status of a sign in the coherence of eternal return. So simulacra are the goal. They are what we should be looking to understand reality, because they are difference. It's not that they're not different in relation to something. They themselves are different in themselves. That's what it means to say, to call this chapter difference in itself. It's not that there's a difference to or with relation to something else, because then we're mediating away the difference. It's only different in relation to something. Rather, the copies are themselves difference. They themselves are a flux of questions and problems and responses and answers. There's this difference is embodied in the copies, not just from their relation to some superior form. So he's kind of bringing simulacra to the forefront. They are, like he says, they are the superior forms. They include difference within themselves. So the challenge is for everything to become its own simulacrum. So there is no longer any sense in which we can talk about an original and a copy. That whole model just disappears. It's just all difference, which is cool. Right? It's hard to deny that. I don't know. Maybe you can deny it. People are denying it all the time, I guess. But yeah, I that just really resonates with me. Of course, we should just be wary of confusing this notion of simulacra with Baudrillard's postmodern version, where, I mean, for him, it's kind of like a deterioration, right? You've got a faithful copy and then of an original, and then you've got an unfaithful copy of an original, and then that becomes deteriorates further to a sign that pretends to be a faithful copy but isn't, and then finally you've just got this sign that doesn't even bother pretending to be a faithful copy anymore. The hyperreal, it's just purely artificial. There is no solid grounding behind it anymore. And that whole picture, while it has value in itself, is totally different, I think, from what Deleuze is suggesting here. And the difference basically is metaphysics versus the everyday, right? Deleuze is talking about metaphysical reality, what reality is like in itself, whereas Baudrillard is talking about everyday reality, the world in which we live, the things that we do, the things that we produce, the activities we engage in, all of those kinds of things. And so there's just a complete disconnect between those two levels. This is kind of like, and this is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, because it seems that there is this kind of confusion which crops up quite often, especially when you're reading people who are criticizing or critiquing other philosophers. Sometimes the critique is aimed at a different level from which the philosopher that they're critiquing is working on. And I think of this is like my version of Heidegger's ontological difference. For Heidegger, established this difference between the ontological level and the ontic level. And I think there is the same difference between the metaphysical and well, the phenomenological, the ontological, the everyday. These are all different. And this is where it gets tricky, because we're not talking about I'm not talking in terms of substance. I'm not talking in terms of an alternate reality that this one is kind of grounded on. It's just metaphysical reality is just reality as it is. It's the ultimate structure, the framework of the universe. And the other levels are on top of that, but it's not like there's this hidden realm which we can access if we meditate in the right way, or for 20 years in a cave on a mountaintop or something, and somehow learn to access this world. That's mystical. I'm thinking there are some choice words that I want to use to describe that, but I'll refrain. But that's veering in the direction of mysticism. Whereas what's happening here, what I see is going on, is that Deleuze is talking about metaphysics, metaphysical reality, the way reality is, and what it is it's difference. It's difference in itself. Everything that we see, we pass at the level of human perception, incorporates this at its most fundamental. So you've got this metaphysical truth that Deleuze is talking about, this metaphysical reality, which is difference, which is in which there is no original and copy, in which everything is a copy, because everything is, well, even that's not the right way to say it, because there is no such thing as a copy in relation to an original. So everything is just difference in itself. Everything is entirely different through and through, not just different in relation to other things. That's metaphysically what's going on. Whereas for Baudrillard, who talks about the same thing, simulacra, for him, he's operating on a completely different level. He's discussing economic and political realities that we deal with, which, although he's using the same word, that's the trick. We've got to make sure that we understand this metaphysical difference, which I think exists. So I don't know. Maybe I've belabored that point. Maybe it's pretty obvious, but yeah, that's one of the things that and I did it with Watsuji. If you watch the Japanese, the series I did on him, because he does the same with regards to Buddhism. We had a really solid insight, phenomenological insight, which then became distorted when he tried to raise it to the level of a metaphysical insight in terms of Buddhism. So valuing or turning to concepts like absolute emptiness and nothingness and these kinds of things that, while they have a lot of meaning and content at the level of the phenomenological, once you go to once you try and just transpose them to the metaphysical, you end up talking nonsense. You end up talking gibberish, and that's where I made a whole video on that. And it's just that same thing, the metaphysical difference. You can't cross these levels and talk about them in the same way. So anyway, yeah, that turned into a massive little rant about comparing Baudrillard and Deleuze, but just because they use the same word, simulacra. But I think there are very different things going on with those two. Okay, enough of that. Let's move into the last section, which is just a kind of wrap up. So let me start with a quote. There are a couple of really good quotes here, which kind of bring everything together and focus on what I think Deleuze wants us to take away from this chapter. Representation fails to capture the affirmed world of difference, Representation has only a single center, a unique and receding perspective, and in consequence, a false depth. It mediates everything, but mobilizes and moves nothing. Movement, for its part, implies a plurality of centers, a superposition of perspectives, a tangle of points of view, a coexistence of moments which essentially distort representation. Paintings or sculptures are already such distorters, forcing us to create movement. So much to break down on that. Just a couple of things though. First, representation has a single center. So this brings us back to harmony. It gives us an organized whole, mediating away all difference to achieve this harmony. But even though it does that, or because it does that, it moves nothing. There's no genuine movement. It's just abstract, conceptual wrangling. That's, I think, what I've called it before somewhere. But just playing with concepts, semantics. You become locked into these logical games where you can juggle terms and reference and just, you can play with your equations to your heart's content. And that doesn't, just because you can do that in the model, doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything going on in reality, or doesn't necessarily refer to reality in any way. And so nothing moves, nothing. It looks like there's something going on. It looks like you're achieving something. It looks like your representation is showing movement, but it's all theoretical. It's all abstract. It's all conceptual. There's no genuine movement being identified here because it's fundamentally divorced from the real. And so movement is something else I wanted to emphasize from that quote. And movement, essentially in this quote, Deleuze is contrasting movement with representation. So I thought that was interesting, just the importance that Deleuze places on movement. And that's a very Bergsonian thing to say, a very Bergsonian way to think about it. But yeah, movement's important. And what about movement? Movement has a plurality of centers, multiple coexisting perspectives and points of view and moments, which all creates a chaotic flux which resists the orderly image that representation seeks to establish. Great. It's kind of an evocative way of thinking about this, but it seems real to me. This seems like it's tapping into something genuine, as opposed to a kind of philosophy in which everything is resolved, all of the problems, all of the differences, everything is resolved into this nice, perfect, complete picture, image of harmony. I feel like it just can't be that way. I don't think reality can possibly function like that. It's far more likely, I think, that metaphysical reality is this kind of chaotic flux, movement, interaction, divergence, decentering, and out of that you get these pockets of order, of coherence. But if you didn't have that original difference, I don't see how you could get the movement that would lead to the order that we see around us. You need some kind of conflict. There has to be some kind of clash of something, of energies, of forces, of elements, in order to get anything happening at all. So if you don't have that at the very beginning, if you don't put that into your metaphysical bedrock, it's hard to see how anything could come out of the universe according to that model, a model of where everything is kind of originally stable, perfect, organized, and the chaos, the difference is kind of represents a kind of breaking away from that more pristine original state. It just doesn't seem to me like you can get anything out of that if you start with order, with organization, with coherence. You have to have this difference that has to be at the core. And so multiple perspectives. So this is not perspectivism, because perspectivism presupposes or kind of implies a fixed, static, complete being on which these multiple perspectives look. So, and Deleuze says actually explicitly that this is not, we have to go beyond this perspectival way of thinking. It's not perspectivism, because yes, you have multiple perspectives, but each perspective is valid in and of itself. Each perspective embodies difference in and of itself, without relation to without relation to anything else. It's not different in relation to some other thing. It itself is just difference. It itself is this embodiment of this this chaotic flux, this coexistence of moments, this tangle of points of view. That is what each individual perspective is. So perspectivism, he's not advocating a kind of perspectivism. And the final thing I wanted to note about that quote was the comment on art forcing us to create movement. Again, not literal movement like physical, but movement in the sense of a real kind of process, leading to a real process, as opposed to the abstract, the conceptual, where it's kind of locked in this abstract realm, but doesn't yield anything, doesn't relate to the concrete, to the real in any meaningful way. And I'll just, on that point, I wrote, it was interesting to me at the time, an article about art. I don't write a lot about aesthetics. I'm not hugely into it, but I saw a photo of Heidegger and Ernst Cassirer, and they were just staring, just facing each other. It seemed fairly congenial. But when I saw that photo, because I was reading about the background of this encounter between the two, and they had some kind of a debate or something, I think it was. But it just seeing that photo made me think, what are they thinking? What's Heidegger's looking? What's he looking at? Is he looking? Cassirer, where is he looking? Are they saying something to each other? What words are they saying? And then I started wondering what's in the background, who's taking the photo. The photo is kind of, there's a frame around it. So what's just to the left here? What's just to the right? Are there other people around there? Do they have their respective supporters behind them? What's the background? And so there were just so many questions that this photo prompted in me. And it just made me think about a time before we had movies and TV, where this was the main kind of medium of representation, and it's so much more engaging because you're not given everything, you're not given all of the information that you need. Whereas this is what I discussed in the article, you watch a movie or you watch a TV program, and you're bombarded with information. There's too much information actually to take in, but you're given everything. There are no questions left over for you to ask because you're just bombarded with information all the time. And when you watch a program, I think, or a movie, there is that sense where you just kind of shut down, you know. So it's passive, right? It's a passive form of activity. It's a passive form of engagement, but it's, yeah, you can feel it, right? When you watch something, you just don't have to think. The director, the actors, that they're doing all the thinking for you. You're just sitting there and just letting this information wash all over you. But with a photo, you have to get involved in it. You're stimulated to ask these questions, to delve into the picture itself, into the image, and pick up things that are maybe not immediately apparent, or to wonder about things that you can't know the answer to. And so it's very active. And that was kind of what I was thinking of here with the way that Deleuze talks about art forcing us to create movement. We are engaged. We're picked up. That's maybe not quite the right way to put it either. We pick up the artwork, and we become a part of it. We work with it, but we have to do something. It calls on us to react in some way. So we have to expend some effort to get that out. And that, I think, corresponds nicely with what Deleuze is talking about here, this movement. Art inspires movement. Contrasting with something like a movie where you don't do anything. There is no movement, mental movement, or there's just no movement at all. It's just all passive. You're just taking in the survey of information. So anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting and maybe a relevant example. The second quote I want to give you to close off this chapter goes like this. Eternal return relates to a world of differences implicated one in the other, to a complicated, properly chaotic world without identity. The world is neither finite nor infinite as representation would have it. It is completed and unlimited. So that one, I just wanted to bring your attention to this, finite and infinite. The world is not finite because it's not completely defined. It's not completely definable even. It can't be analyzed in that way to a point of resolution. We can't grasp it through analysis. It's not accessible to us in that way through analysis. Hence, it's not finite. And the world is not infinite either, because it's not infinitely large or infinitely small. It doesn't extend, it doesn't go on forever in the sense that it lacks boundaries. But neither does it go on forever down. You can't analyze it down such that it kind of, we can imagine it extending to infinity, downwards as opposed to upwards. Because it's not that kind of thing, and then it doesn't make any sense conceptually. And infinity is one of those concepts where it does make sense as a concept, and you can use it in a model, in a mathematical representation, for example. But when you try and apply it to reality, I think the concepts just break down. It doesn't make any sense to talk about the universe or reality being infinite in those two ways, infinitely large or infinitely small. I don't think they have any meaning when you try and bring them into a discussion of reality. So it's neither finite nor infinite. And I said it. I wrote it. Nice. The finite and the infinite are conceptual, so they're limited to representation. That's what I was saying before. For Deleuze, the world is completed but unlimited. So completed in the sense of not being infinite. not carrying on forever in some way, either up or down into the realm of the large or the small, as if it were unbounded. But it's unlimited because it's full of potentialities. It's full of these differences which are implicated in each other. It is difference. Problems and questions that suggest responses which then alter the entire landscape again. So it's full of these never static points which resolve temporarily and create new issues and problems and responses, questions that call for new responses, that call for new solutions, resolutions, and it's just a continual cycle there. So basically, the essence of this chapter, I think, is an argument for a complete decentering, a plurality of perspectives, but a plurality of perspectives which are each autonomous and in possession of their own sense. So not perspectivism. It's a formless, ungrounded chaos. There is no ground which we can resolve to at this metaphysical level. We can't resolve to a kind of static, complete, ordered foundation of any sort. It's ungrounded chaos, and it has no law other than its own repetition. A continuous evolution which diverges and decenters, and this ungrounded chaos is precisely difference. And that, I think, brings us to the end of the video. So let's look at a summary. So first, we talked about Plato, and there were 4 figures in the Platonic dialectic for Deleuze. The first was the selection of difference. So this involved the method of division that Plato set up, which opposed a good and a bad, or an authentic and an inauthentic. And the idea there was we're opposing, we're contrasting this with Aristotle's method of division, which was genus and species, in which one is absorbed into the other. The second figure was the installation of a myth, and this is essentially how the first step by which Plato establishes difference, by which Plato will determine between the good and the bad, the authentic and the inauthentic. The third figure was the establishment of a foundation, and this came about through the myth again, but it was the way that the myth gave us a ground, an original, a form, capital F form, which served as the ideal exemplar of some particular quality. And the fourth figure was the positing of a question problem complex, and that was basically what the test composed of, what the test was composed of, an enigma that had to be resolved. And the important point there was this problematic structure belonged to the objects themselves. It's a part of reality. It's not something that arises on top of something else, on top of a more substantial, fixed kind of being. It is what being is itself. Being is this problematic structure, this never organized, completed flux. Hence the whole thing of the non-being or question mark being that Deleuze talks about. And then we looked at simulacra, and the difference here then being between the thing itself and the simulacra. Overturning Platonism involved seeing beyond that difference, changing the way that we think about reality such that there is no original and copy. That model no longer works to describe reality. It's all simulacra. And then our summary, we looked at a couple of things that I'll just point out here. First was the distinction between representation and movement. So movement being really important here, being central, not as in physical movement, obviously, but as in but something real, a real movement, not just playing with terms, not just substituting one term for another, and altering, expressions in a representational model of some kind. Moving beyond that conceptual, that abstract conceptual realm, which we can get lost in sometimes when we're doing analytic philosophy, and just making sure that we tie our understanding of metaphysics to reality in some way, such that there is, which means embodying, embracing, including genuine movement, not just conceptual movement. Then we saw that the world is completed and unlimited. So completed because it's not infinite, but unlimited because it's full of potentialities. It's all difference. It's all difference. And finally, reality is decentered. It's a formless, ungrounded chaos. That great quote, a plurality of centers, a superposition of perspectives, a tangle of points of view, a coexistence of moments, which essentially distort representation. And this is basically just another way of saying difference. Okay, cool. So that's difference in itself. Man, I'm so glad I didn't try and squeeze that in at the end of last week's video. That would have broken me, I think. But anyway, that's us for this one. So we'll move on into repetition for itself next week. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next week.